Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us in another one of our regular event series here for the Centre for Brexit Studies. Today's event, of course, is a topic that's become very, I don't think relevant may be the word, but it's quite the topic of the moment, of course, and that is the status of the different home nations within the United Kingdom, and this sense that Brexit may have accelerated, perhaps, the sense of a possible, maybe breakup is too strong a word. I mean, there is nothing inevitable about a breakup of the United Kingdom, but I think it is fair to say at the moment that the way that particularly Scotland and in a fashion Northern Ireland and even now in Wales are travelling, we see increased support for separation from the UK. And so on that note, I'm very pleased to have four outstanding speakers join us today. We have our own Jay Rowe. Jay is doing a PhD with me looking at English voter perception. So he's going to talk around the issue of England and attitudes to Brexit and underpinning factors there. Drawing on an interdisciplinary perspective from psychology and sociology as well as politics. Jay will then be followed by Richard Wynne-Jones, who runs the Welsh Governance Centre in Cardiff University. I'll do a more expanded bio for each of the speakers as we introduce them. And then we have Katy Hayward, who is a senior fellow with UK and a Changing Europe and a professor at Queen's University Belfast. And Katy's expertise, of course, is around issues relating to the Northern Ireland border. So we're very pleased to have Katy join us again. And then last but not least, we have Mike Danson, who's, I suppose your official title now would be Emeritus Professor, wouldn't it, Mike? Being technically retired, although seemingly not in actuality. Mike is a bit of a polymath. He brings a wide-ranging expertise around areas and issues relating to governance, labour markets, regional development, and associated political economy issues. And Mike is going to talk around the Scottish dimension. So, of course, to reiterate, very contentious in the news at the moment, of course, a recent Savannah Comrades poll for the Scotsman put support for independence around 58% for respondents who expressed a preference. And I think we've also, of course, we have seen polls that suggest majority support for a border poll in Northern Ireland as well, which I think put it at something like 57%. Katy, you might correct me if I've missed something there. So they're very interesting times that we live in, to use the ancient Chinese proverb. So the format today is going to be 15 minutes for each speaker. We're going to have the speakers follow each other, and then we'll reserve questions at the end. So we're hoping to have roughly half an hour of questions. Each speaker gets 15 minutes. I am aware that we have a lot of people registered with us today. So some of you will be watching us on the YouTube channel. And if you are, as I'm reminded, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, please post your questions below in the comments box. That's with YouTube, of course, the format where you have the image at the top and then you can post comments underneath. If you're using Zoom, of course, you can feed into our live chat feed. A bit of basic etiquette, of course, given the nature of the subject area. It can arouse strong passions on both sides. So I would remind all participants, please, to keep your comments objective and reasonable and not personal. I know that anyone won't do this, but just to point out, we can block offensive comments and people who are repeat offenders can be removed from the platform. But I don't think that's going to happen. So, we're all going to enjoy this debate in a friendly and amicable spirit. So, on that note, then, I'm going to hand over to Jay. Jay, you ready with your presentation, are you?
Yep.
Okay, and I would ask you all, please, if you're not actively participating, to keep on mute. So, okay, Jay, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. In order to understand English voters' thoughts and feelings about Brexit, I began with three research questions. Firstly, how did English voters construct their English and European identities before the UK left the EU? Secondly, how did major English parties communicate the potential impact of Brexit before the UK left the EU? And finally, how did the psychological traits of cognitive centrality of a particular identity and also collective narcissism affect general election voting behaviour in 2019 and 2017 in England. So we had three main research methods for this study. It's conducted under a mixed methods paradigm. The first two online social surveys, known as the English Attitude Survey and the European Attitude Survey, 5 focus groups with a combination of Leave and Remain voters, and 6 textual thematic analyses of election manifestos of English parties, 3 of them being pro-Leave parties and 3 being pro-second referendum parties, if not pro-Remain parties. Basically, the online social surveys used 2 scales, the social identification scale by Naomi Almers and the collective narcissism scale by Agnieszka Golek-Dyzevala and her colleagues as well. So basically, the social identity scale is a way of measuring how important any single social identity is, such as English identity or European identity, is to the way individuals construct their own social identity. 2 of the most influential studies in the field of social identity theory are by Obst and White in 2005, which examines the relationship between social identity and a psychological sense of community, being how psychologically close an individual feels to that particular in-group community. And a second I'd draw your attention to is by Marilyn Brewer in 1991, which examines the relationship between an individual's desire to belong to an in-group and also their need to express their own individuality. Regarding collective narcissism, the collective narcissism scale measures what the researchers argue is an unrealistic belief about an in-group's greatness, or an over-exaggerated appraisal of the merits of an in-group, basically. Several other studies have attempted to understand the causes and consequences of collective narcissism scale. And you'll see at the end of this PowerPoint, I've given you some links where you can read up about both social identity theory and collective narcissism. So regarding the studies that I conducted, the focus groups ask 3 direct questions and then allow the participants to discuss them in great depth, basically, amongst each other. The first question is, what does English identity mean to you? The second is, what does European identity mean to you? And the third is, how do you feel Brexit will impact your close friends and immediate family? And you'll see on this slide the 6 parties that were chosen for the textual analysis of the general election manifestos. Here's just a little breakdown of the samples that were that made up the English Attitude Survey and the European Attitude Survey. You might see towards the right of each of these images, the samples did skew more towards the Remain party, Remain in 2016 and Remain in 2019 of the binary. But that's possibly because a lot of the participants were students, young people who were quite close to the sample pool that we had access to. You see, with the focus groups, the demographics are a little bit more even than the online social surveys, but I think we can still draw some conclusions from each of the 2. You'll see here. With the English Attitude Survey, I haven't put it on the slide, but the English social identification, also the English, when English is placed as the in-group in the social identification scale, Leave voters had significantly higher mean score of English social identification. So for Leave voters, the mean score was 5.45, compared to Remain voters at 3.75. And with collective narcissism, English collective narcissism, Leave voters scored 3.58 as a mean score, compared to 2.05. In layman's terms, this means that for Leave voters, their English social identity is more cognitively central to their individual social identity in total. And also they have potentially unhealthy appraisal of their English identity as well. And here with the European identity findings, the results are somewhat flipped, but in a quite interesting way as well. With the European social identity, the ESI, the mean score for Remain voters was 5.18 compared to 2.58 for Leave voters. And with Remain voters, for their European collective narcissism was 3.59 compared to 2.05, indicating again that European identity was more cognitively central for Remain voters compared to Leave voters, and also a slightly more unhealthy appraisal of the in-group greatness of the Europeans, of the European social identity group. But you'll see when you compare the two scores, English social identity is much higher than European among Leave voters than European social identity is among Remain voters. So in sum, I think the English social identity is much more significant overall, basically. And here we have, these are some of the results from the focus groups. As you can see here, for Leave voters, the English identity is really centered on preserving traditions and celebrating heritage here. We have some interesting quotes here from Olivia, particularly, was very celebratory of Queen Elizabeth and the royal family in general during the focus groups. She also, her and several other Leave voters really praised the importance of the army as how they construct their English identity. And also Leave voters really engaged with contemporary debates about removing statues and reappraising history, particularly of the British Empire, but really the English influence on the British Empire. And they really expressed dismay about the toppling of statues, such as the Colston statue in Bristol, and the defacing of sort of Winston Churchill statues in London and others. Interestingly as well, with Leave voters, their European identity was completely non-salient. They didn't, among the 10 Leave voters in the study, not one of them expressed European identity in any regard, but their rejection of European identity took several forms as well. You can see with Alfie, the first participant here, he doesn't recognize European identity because he feels that Europeans are simply sort of a collection of national identities rather than as a unifying identity. Whereas Harry, who's one of the older participants, he was over 55, I'd place him in his 60s, late 60s, early 70s. He really expressed dissatisfaction with French and German people generally because of his family experience of World War II. So you can see how long this kind of anti-European rhetoric has been around. And with the final participant here, George really disliked the construct of the European Union, and that was the reason for his rejection of his European identity, or the one that he explained during the focus groups. And with the social impact, Leave voters were more, they weren't very vocal about the social impact of Brexit in the terms of the economy or the political influence or rights and laws, legislations. It was really the impact of the social impact of Brexit that really concerned them, was the interpersonal impact of family members and friends, losing friends, being sort of losing acquaintances, jobs, things like this. They didn't really express any interest in economic perceptions, economic discourse, or anything like that, or political discourse. It was all a very personal and emotional impact that they were concerned about. Conversely, whereas Leave voters constructed their English identity sort of historically, for Remain voters that I met during the focus groups, their English identity was really constructed around their support for contemporary multiculturalism, immigration, mixing of cultures, tolerance, a slightly more egalitarian, and sort of that what you could say progressive rather than conservative idea of what it means to be English. And Lily here expressed a little bit of a distaste for the more historical constructions of English identity, whereas Poppy and particularly Jacob were a little bit more reflective on what it means, what being English meant historically in terms of the British Empire and the slightly more inward-looking, as they perceived it, English identity and how it's grown and sort of evolved over time.
Jay, I'll just stop you for 2 seconds. I'll say this now to everyone out there. If I see any offensive terms like snowflake, you will be kicked off. Okay? Please resume.
Cheers, thank you. At the end of that one anyway. Thank you. In terms of European identity, they were much more obviously pro-European than the Leave voters, that goes without saying, but their European identity was tied much more to their membership of the European Union, and the fear for their European identity was concerned with the loss of freedom of movement, the loss of the rights that come with being a European citizen, more so than a social identity. I'd say it's not expressed really on this slide, but their European identity was less significant to them than their British identity and their local identities, but they definitely embraced being an EU citizen during the time that the UK and England was a member of the EU. And finally, for Remain voters, obviously, as I've suggested, their fears and the social impact of Brexit that they were most concerned about was the loss of freedom of movement of people, which is probably one of the highest concerns for Remain voters, and really concerning the social impact of increased tension, more violent societies, and things like that that come along with prolonged social conflict. And concerning the final part of this data collection and analysis is concerning pro-Leave parties and pro-Remain parties. So the pro-Leave parties suggested that the most significant impact of Brexit would be that it restores sovereignty, self-governance, and a more pro-British or pro-English policy, social policy, and international policy as well, with concerns about obviously immigration, the freedom of movement being heavily featured in the discourse of these parties. And with the pro-second referendum parties, finally, they considered the most significant impact of Brexit to be the damage that it would do to the health, well-being, and particularly international reputation of the UK as being one of the more forward-thinking, forward-looking, and progressive countries in the UK. And some examples from the Liberal Democrats, Greens, and Labour here. And in summary, basically, so with social identification and collective narcissism, the pro-Leave party votes in the 2017 general election and the 2019 general election were influenced by a preference for a Leave vote in a hypothetical second referendum, and also by English collective narcissism. With Leave voters, they consider themselves to be traditionally English, not European, and the most significant impact of Brexit would be on their interpersonal relationships rather than on the economy or the political system. With the Remain voters, they were more multiculturally English. They were pro-EU rather than European, and they felt that they would be impacted most by freedom of movement restrictions and by increased social conflict. Pro-Leave parties said that Brexit will be an opportunity for self-interest and self-rule, and pro-second referendum parties worried that Brexit would contribute to a diminished reputation for England and the UK, and to a damage to citizen well-being. There could be more follow-up studies relating to more local English identities and cultural English identities, and I would be interested in doing some more research with different psychological measures in addition to social identification and collective narcissism. And here are some references. I can send these out to anyone who wants them as well. I've got more references if anyone's interested as well. Thank you very much.
Jay, thanks. You're welcome, and well done on that. You kept the time as well, so pretty impressive.
Oh,
you make an interesting inference there. Yes, I mean, your obvious point, I suppose, about Brexit being seen as a sort of resurgent English nationalism and related questions around English identity. I mean, it's just fascinating to look at census data and see the corollary and the absolute decline of British identity. You know, it's quite stark. I think the census data that we have from 2011, really some time ago, I think suggested only 25% of people in England felt British.
Yeah, and not so much in big cities as well. It's more provincial, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean the split between London and the so-called rest of England is quite stark. I mean, only in London did Britishness compete with Englishness as a self-identified national identity. That's the point. What do people self-identify as? And that's before we then consider for want of a better phrase, that the Celtic nations, which we're going to come on to now. So we'll come back to that in question time. Plenty of time for questions there. Our next speaker, as I said, is Richard Wynne Jones, and Richard is director of the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff Uni, and he's written extensively on devolved politics and nationalism, and is considered to be one of the founders of critical security studies. His latest book, Englishness, The Political Force Transforming Britain, co-authored with Elsa Henderson, will be published by Oxford University Press in March. And so on that note, Richard, over to you, please.
Hello, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just going to kick straight into this, not least because I've got, I'm kind of pushing at the edges of 15 minutes here, and I want to cover a lot of ground. I've decided not to stay in my lane. I do apologise. I'm not going to talk simply about Wales. I'm going to talk largely about Britain, although a little bit about Northern Ireland, which hopefully won't go across what Katy's about to say. So basically what I want to say is this. So let me just give you a sense of where we're going. What I want to show you is how the Brexit vote revealed and further exacerbated deep fissures across all of the UK, and this is important, arranged around different senses of national identity. And what we see is kind of nationality politics operating not only in the kind of so-called Celtic fringe, but very much in the English core of the state. Second point really is that Brexit supporters in the core were always aware that their desired outcome of Brexit would threaten the UK union, but have been willing not only in theory to pay that price, we've got plenty of evidence that that's something that they are, in an abstract sense, is a price they're willing to pay, but what we've seen in practice is that the UK government has chosen to implement Brexit in the ways that are most undermining of the union. And that speaks to something which is a really interesting dimension of the UK union, is that this is a union with remarkably few unionists. You've got people who are kind of ambiguous unionists, but very few people who are willing to sacrifice any other value to maintain the union. And so we're now in a situation again where the UK government is breaking up an established order with no clear idea of what to put in its place. And I would say is taking advice from people who don't know either. So I think we're going from, there's a kind of voodoo economics that we've seen around Brexit. The idea that, geography doesn't really matter in trade, that non-tariff barriers aren't really a thing, and so on and so forth. We're moving from that to a kind of voodoo constitutional politics. And I noticed that Boris Johnson is going up to Scotland today to tell everybody there how committed he is to the union. And you get all this rhetoric, but in terms of the substance, I actually don't think there is much substance. And so what we're seeing, and this will be my final point, is that we've got the UK government deliberately undermining the middle position of devolution. And it's pushing electorates to either choose between exit or assimilation, so leaving the UK altogether, or kind of assimilating into a central state and undermining the devolution settlements that have evolved over the last 20 years. So they're options, but I think it's at least as probable that we're going to end up in a period of kind of long-term toxic stasis, which I think is very unfortunate indeed. So let me start with some data. I'm not going to give you the kind of formal statistical proofs of all of this. As you'll see, the relationships that I'm going to show you are really strong anyway. But if you're interested in seeing the kind of the formal statistical evidence, and I direct you to this. We've got an article which has just been published in Regional Studies that analyses the different Brexit votes in Scotland, England and Wales and shows what's going on. But what I'm going to show you is some data that will show you the relationship between national identity and attitudes to Brexit. So this is the idea that this was a very divisive vote in terms of national identity. In England, and I guess it's a slight difference from what Jay has just been seeing, we've got kind of interesting relationship between Englishness and Britishness. I guess it was implicit in what you were saying, Jay, but this is a slightly different take on it. When we ask people in social surveys about identity, and these data, this is the British Elections Survey from, and it's the 2016 referendum wave of that. So this is the kind of Rolls-Royce data that we have on all of this, and it allows us to compare England, Scotland, and Wales, but not Northern Ireland, unfortunately, because they don't do Northern Ireland as part of British surveys. Election surveys. What you find is if you ask people to identify as English, British, or whatever combination or anything else, what you find is that there are three identity groups that really dominate. There's a group of, the largest group identify as strongly British and strongly English. Then we've got the second largest group, which is strongly English only. Then we've got the third largest group, which is strongly British only, and then we've got, that makes up around almost 80% of the population of England, and then you've got, you know, there's a small group of people who say they're Irish and so on and so forth. But these are the three key groups, and what we saw in 2016 was a really striking difference between these groups on attitudes to Brexit. And now, just to make this simple, this is the leave percentage of these three groups, okay? And what you can see is that the strongly, if you look at the two polls, the strongly English only, almost three quarters, very, very nearly three quarters of a strongly English only voted leave, as compared to just less than 40% of the strongly British only. And then obviously the key line here is between those people who have strong English identity, either alone, exclusively, or in combination with strong British identity. These voted by almost 2/3 leave. So in other words, once you have strong English identity as part of the picture, you have a very strong propensity to vote leave. And that's, and again, I'm not going to show you the kind of robustness checking of all of this, but that survives everything that you throw at the model, all the things that you've heard about in the analysis. Usually people leave out national identity in England when they look at this, but actually you add everything else to the model and this survives as a very significant relationship. And you're not going to be surprised looking at just eyeballing those data. That then compares to, let's do Scotland. Scotland is relatively straightforward, but what we've got here is we've got Scottish identity, British identity. I'm adding in English just so we can actually compare with England itself, but also this will be particularly interesting when we get to Wales. And there are some people who feel strongly Scottish, strongly British and strongly English, but there aren't many There aren't many of them. There aren't many people who feel strongly Scottish and strongly English. There aren't actually many people who feel strongly English only in Scotland, but I've left that group in just for comparative purposes. The largest, in terms of the demographics of Scotland, the Scottish only group is by far the largest of these 5 identity groups that I'm looking at, which make up 86%. So we're capturing the action in Scotland here, basically. The second largest group is the British and Scottish, then the British only, then the British English. If we then look at the leave vote percentage in each of these groups, what you see here is if we take the two ends of the spectrum, the strongly Scottish only vote overwhelmingly Remain, only around 1 in 4 vote Leave. The English and British, they are the most likely to vote Leave in Scotland, but it's interesting that the Leave sentiment associated with Englishness is attenuated in Scotland, which I think is quite an interesting dimension, and that raises interesting questions as to what's going on. Is it because of a kind of social effect? Is it because the media is different in Scotland, living in a different kind of political culture? Anyway, but the key thing here is then just to notice the jump in Eurosceptic sentiment between those people who feel Scottish only and those people who feel Scottish and British. There's a big strengthening of Eurosceptic sentiment when Britishness is added to the pile, or to the identity matrix in Scotland. And this speaks to something that, again, I'm not going to spend any time proving to you with kind of all kinds of robustness checking, but basically what you find, and I think this is one of the kind of key things in our research and all of this, is that those people, the attitudes that associate with Englishness in England, they tend to attach with Britishness in Scotland, and indeed, as we'll see in a moment, in Wales. And I assume in Northern Ireland. We don't have the data, but I'm quite happy to take a bet that this is also the case in Northern Ireland, which means there are all kinds of interesting implications to that. But one of them is that Britishness means different things in different parts of the UK. So Britishness in metropolitan London, to go back to the example that Alex was mentioning a few moments ago, is different from the Britishness that you find in the Rhondda Valley or in Glasgow or in East Belfast. Okay, so that is something that people, when you think about it for a second, yeah, I guess it makes intuitive sense, but people very, very seldom think through the implications of that. Wales is the most complicated, certainly of the 3 home nations in Britain, not least because the demographics in Wales are more complicated. In Wales, not only do we have a group of Welsh identifiers, surprise, surprise, but because of demographic shift, we have a large group of people in Wales who consider themselves to be English. And just in terms of the relative sizes of these groups, and again, we're capturing with these kind of 5 cells, we're capturing, almost 85% of the Welsh population. So we're really getting most of the action in terms of what's going on in Wales. Here, the largest group is British and Welsh. The second largest group is the Welsh only. British English next, British only, and then I've had, the English identifying group isn't very large, but it's interesting because I'm now going to show you this. These are the leave percentages of each groups in Wales. And again, on both sides of the spectrum, Welsh identifiers, Welsh only, look very much like the Scottish only, so overwhelmingly pro-European. And actually, I won't go into detail about this, but within that Welsh only group, Welsh speakers, people like myself, you've probably worked out from my accent, overwhelmingly even more pro-European. On the other end of the spectrum, the English and the English British look very much like the English and English British in England. So there's no kind of amelioration of English Euroscepticism in Wales. But then, interestingly, the big jump here is between the kind of really significant thing in terms of the overall result in Wales, some of you recall that Wales voted narrowly leave. The big jump here is that once Britishness is added to Welsh identity, that group becomes firmly Eurosceptic. Just interestingly, if you're worried or if you're interested in why this British group is slightly lower in terms of leave percentage than the British English or the British Welsh, this group contains a group of people who are very much like the British in English. So some of these people are very much like basically Cardiff academics is what I would call them. People who look very much like the British in say, central London or indeed in Birmingham. So what we see here is you've got this kind of overall story here is you've got very polarized views of Europe reflecting national identity differences in all of the three countries. So we've got nationality politics at work in all of the three countries. It means that the kind of Leave alliance is kind of unstable, because as we see, the Leave voters in England are willing to sacrifice the interests of British identifiers in Scotland, who tend to be pro-union. But also on the Remain side, you've got, kind of the metropolitan Remainers in England who, often don't have very much in common with Remain supporters who are Welsh identifiers in Scotland and who are increasingly pro-independence, and in Wales, who, as we'll see in a moment, are also increasingly pro-independence. So just very quickly, and I'm conscious of time, and here, but just kind of just so that's the kind of context of the Brexit vote. In terms of then operationalizing Brexit, well, obviously we know that it was always going to be difficult if we went towards Brexit and this kind of reassertion of traditional notions of Westminster parliamentary sovereignty. It was always going to be difficult to accommodate devolution with that, because this is all about taking back control, reasserting parliamentary sovereignty. Devolution fits very uncomfortably into that overall kind of mindset. Leavers were always aware of the dangers of Brexit for the Union. If you look at Johnson's 2 articles, you remember that Boris Johnson famously wrote 2 articles when he was trying to decide if he was going to support Leave or Remain. If you look at the Remain version, he highlights specifically the threat to the Union arising from Brexit, but continues nonetheless to support Brexit, which puts his visit to Scotland today, I think, in perspective. We also know from evidence collected by Ilse Henderson and myself, and then repeated by all kinds of other people, that overwhelming majorities of Conservative Leave supporters, so people who support the Conservative and Unionist Party, who support Leave, overwhelmingly in England and in Wales, by something like 85% of them, so incredibly high percentage, say that they think that a Scottish Indie ref and a yes vote in that referendum and a border poll in Northern Ireland and Irish unity would be a price worth paying for Brexit. So not only have people been aware of the risks, but they've been willing to accept actually losing the bet, if you like. So winning Brexit and losing the UK Union. That is something that people have been aware of as a possibility and have been willing to pay the price. And of course, in the way that Brexit has been enacted, the eventual agreement with the EU saw the creation of effectively an economic border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. I kind of defer to Katy on the exact language we should be using, but it looks like an economic border to me. There may be another term. But also we've seen the devolved governments being completely ignored in the Brexit negotiations. And the UK Internal Market Act clearly undermines devolved competences in ways that weren't actually necessary for the coherence of the legislation. And we're seeing European Union structural funds, which have been particularly important somewhere like Wales, being, the plan is to do something in a way that can, again, deliberately undermines devolution. So we have the UK government actually using the opportunity of Brexit to re-centralise the UK state. Finally, and briefly, so what we're seeing is that, and this speaks to the kind of future. So this, up to now I've been talking about where are we, how we got here, where are we. In terms of the future, we're seeing the UK government undermining the current model of devolution, and of course doing so without a mandate. It's worth making that clear, that this was never, in the 2016 referendum, people in Scotland and Wales were told that Brexit would strengthen devolution. There's been no explicit recognition by the UK government. Indeed, it's in denial of the fact that Brexit is being done in a way that undermines devolution. And what we have at the moment is that they are undermining the existing order without any clear sense of what they want to put in its place, which you may think is kind of Brexit all over again. And we've got policy based on a series of cliches. So the one that you hear a lot is no more devolve and forget, but is actually leading to kind of constitutional incoherence and instability. The Welsh government is particularly interesting here because this is a pro-union Labour government that's in despair over the way that the UK government is undermining devolution and undermining the settled will of the Welsh electorate in the process. Meanwhile, you have an opposition with Gordon Brown, interestingly, playing the leading role, continuing to be in denial about nationality politics, especially in and around England. So this idea that what you need is kind of devolution within England, which we know that English identifiers, by the way, are extremely suspicious of. This is meant to be a way of putting the union back together again. It goes against the grain of everything that we know about opinion in England at the moment. And so what we have, just in conclusion, is we've got Brexit being now actually undermining existing devolution. We've got a Conservative government that's increasingly flirting with with the idea of actually abolishing devolution. This is increasingly where the Conservative Party is going in Wales, certainly. And what that is doing is pushing up support for exit. So we've now have obviously consistent leads in Scotland in polling for independence, which you've already heard. Northern Ireland, it's clear that even in that very delicate context, we now have more pressure for a border poll. But we know from pre-Brexit polling that the harder the Brexit, the more likely you are to have support for Irish unity. But even in Wales, we now have support for independence, which hasn't really been on the agenda until about 2 or 3 years ago, now up to around 1 in 3. And interestingly, half of Labour supporters in Wales, and Labour has won every general election in Wales since 1922, half of Labour supporters in Wales now say they would vote yes in a referendum. So that's the situation. It's not clear, however, if there is a route to independence or Irish unity that's achievable. There's certainly no democratic route to abolishing devolution. If there was a referendum on abolishing devolution in Scotland and Wales, there's no prospect of a majority for that. So what we have is potentially a long-term, toxic, morally catastrophic. Look at what's happened in Catalonia, where democratic politicians have been locked up. We have a potentially long-term, toxic crisis of state legitimacy with no obvious way out. Okay, with that, I will stop and hand over.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks. That was sort of in a bind there because, I mean, we're sort of trying to keep the time, but your presentation was so fascinating, I thought I'd let it run. So apologies to the other panelists.
I apologise for overrunning. Sorry.
Well, no, look, I mean, it was, I was just going to say, you get right-wing commentators like David Goodhart who go on about the somewheres and the nowheres. And of course, that argument falls over straight away when you think of Welsh language speakers in Gwynedd and so on, who surely are amongst the most sort of place-rooted people you can think of. You know, as you say, the strong national identity, and yet overwhelmingly pro-European. I sometimes wonder whether the pro-Europeanness is a sort of, you know, I think something Tom Nairn spoke about years ago with the breakup of Britain, and he sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he essentially phrased the European dimension as a counterweight to Westminster.
Yeah, well, that's certainly part of what's going on. I'm not buying into some of the narratives that are associated with Brexit. Yeah, I mean, without the article in Regional Studies that I mentioned actually compares different and tries to model these different explanations. And interestingly, lots of the explanations of Brexit around, you know, people from somewhere, people from nowhere, the so-called left behinds, they systematically exclude Scotland and Northern Ireland from the data. So, you know, you're getting an incredibly skewed version, and the kind of popular versions of what Brexit has all been about don't really stand up to any robust checking, especially when you add in data from Scotland and Northern Ireland when it's available, and add in national identity as a variable.
Yeah. So, no, we may have time to come back to that later, but I'm going to move on to our next speaker now with Katy Hayward. Katy, I'll just give you a brief bio if that's okay. As I mentioned, Katy is a professor at Queen's University in political sociology, senior fellow in UK and a Changing Europe think tank, where she's currently leading a major project on the future and status of Northern Ireland. She's written and presented widely on the topic of Brexit to media, policy, civic and academic audiences. And Katy was appointed to the technical expert panel of the UK government's Alternative Arrangements Advisory Group on Brexit in 2019 and received a special award from the Hewitt Biggs Memorial Prize in 2020 for her work on the implications of Brexit for the whole island of Ireland. She is a member of the working groups on referendums on Irish unification, which has recently produced its interim report. So on that note, Katy, I'm going to hand over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Alex. I have a PowerPoint to share, and I will try and do that now.
No worries.
There we go. I'm trusting that you can see that okay. So it's a great pleasure to be on this panel today, and thank you for your interest in Northern Ireland. So I'm just going to share with you some findings from the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. You'll have seen the Sunday Times a story this weekend past about various polls in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And the results from the Life and Times surveys are slightly different, and I will explain that in a little bit of detail because it's quite significant. But essentially, the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, it's time series data, it's run every year. And basically it's based on face-to-face interviews with around 1,200 adults randomly sampled across Northern Ireland to be representative of the population. And this data is very useful because it's quite rigorous, but it also gives us an opportunity to see the way that things are changing over time. So just to look at the questions on Irish unity, every year since the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, we've asked people what they think the long-term policy for Northern Ireland should be. And as you can see from this, we didn't have a survey in 2011. That's why that's missing. But essentially, there's been there hasn't been any seriously dramatic changes. What you'll notice in 2016 is a drop in support for remaining in the UK with devolution. But where where people moved was actually to be more in favour of direct rule, funnily enough. This was in the period where we had actually parties in trying out sort of opposition in Northern Ireland, which is very unusual. We have a sort of a mandatory coalition here. And then, of course, we had the suspension of institutions during the EU negotiations. So we've seen not dramatic trend in one particular way, fairly steadily. We've come down to a situation where support for remaining in the UK stands at around 50% or so. And that matches with the lucid talk polls. So the other polling that's happening using a very different methodology, but both of these forms of methods show that there's around 50% support for the union, which isn't necessarily terribly strong. And then this question, this was from the 2019 results. We're about to get the 2020 results. If there was a referendum tomorrow and you've been asked to vote whether Northern Ireland should reunify with the Republic of Ireland, how would you vote? We see there that support for Irish unity is around 25%. This is significantly different from the lucid talk polls. And this is a fascinating question for academics to debate as to why this is. And actually, we'll find out a little bit about that with the latest Northern Ireland Life and Times from last year, because of course we couldn't conduct those surveys face-to-face. We had to use online methods. So we'll see if there's a difference, if there is a so-called shy nationalist vote, which is basically people don't want to say face-to-face that they would vote for Irish unity, but maybe they would do if it was a different type of method. So we'll find that out. But essentially, as I say, the consistent point is around 50% being pro-union. Now, what we've seen over time, which is interesting, I think, is what's happening within those blocks, within unionism and within nationalism. And indeed, amongst those who say they're neither unionist nor nationalist, which have been the largest proportion of our respondents for many years now. What we saw in 2018, which generated a lot of headlines, was 50% of our respondents were saying that they were neither unionist nor nationalist. Now, when you think of this, the fact that thanks to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, our political institutions, all our political parties, bar a few, are centred upon that unionist-nationalist divide. So it's very interesting to see that in 2018, 1 in 2 people said they were neither. Now, this figure dropped in 2019 down to 39%. And that was the lowest proportion it's been since 2005. And interestingly enough, where people moved was back towards unionism. So we haven't necessarily seen a trend of increasing number of people saying that they're nationalists or having nationalist sentiments. Actually, there's been a little bit of a hardening within the unionism and nationalist blocs, so to speak. Nonetheless, I think it is really worth emphasizing the fact that the largest portion of the population say that they're neither unionist nor nationalist, and that isn't just young people either. When asked about their anticipation of whether it's likely or unlikely there'll be a united Ireland, possibly unsurprisingly, we see unionists really don't think there will be a united Ireland. They're pretty confident, if you like, that there won't be in the next 20 years. Again, this is different from the lucid talk results. Nationalists think that there will be. And when we come down to the impact that Brexit has had, we've seen that that's made a big difference in basically increasing expectations of a united Ireland amongst nationalists. In 2019, we asked a question about what would make a difference in voting in a border poll. And I've broken this down between Catholic and Protestant respondents, because I think we could probably predict what nationalists and unionists would say, and there is a difference between Catholic and nationalists and Protestant and unionists. So if we look down, so this is these obviously shorthand, but essentially, if there was special provision made for British or for unionist representation in an Irish state, would that make a difference? If we had a continuity of the Northern Ireland Assembly, would that make a difference? If there's a strong economy in the south, EU membership, of course, it's a way of rejoining the EU. Also, at the time, the laws on same-sex marriage and abortion were more liberal in the south. They've changed here, at least in theory. The healthcare service, obviously losing the NHS, and then Scottish independence. Would that make a difference? And we see for Catholics that some things don't make a difference, but notably a strong Irish economy and EU membership would definitely so. Also, interestingly, that they would be more encouraged to vote for United Ireland if there was representation for British and Unionist identity. Now, for the Protestant respondents, things are rather different, and you wouldn't necessarily be surprised to hear that. Notably, very little would make a difference in encouraging them to vote for United Ireland. The one thing that would be a strong economy in the south. Bear in mind, of course, Protestants would include those who are not just unionists, but also neither as well. So this is quite an interesting finding. Unsurprisingly, for anybody who's listened to debates in Northern Ireland, the issue of healthcare is the one that both Catholics and Protestants agree would be a sort of an off-putting factor vis-a-vis United Ireland. And interestingly too, Protestants really, it made no difference for them if there was Scottish independence. For many, if they're a unionist, then that's about Northern Ireland and Britain, whatever Britain looks like, and Scottish independence, according to their views in this poll, wouldn't make a difference to that. Okay, so now onto the question of what difference Brexit has made, and it has made a very significant difference. One thing worth noting is the breakdown of Leave and Remain identities. I'd always be slightly cautious about this, but we know that Northern Ireland obviously voted to remain 56%. And we see this this is the background that we're working on in the NILT survey. Remain has definitely been the majority. And if we match that up to community identity, unionists and nationalists, nationalists very strongly pro-Remain. We see this very much in the party positions as well. Interestingly enough, I'd be really careful about not conflating Leave identities and unionist identities, because we see here maybe around half of unionists are pro-Leave, but also over a quarter are pro-Remain. And that's a really interesting point. What you know, given that the unionist parties since the referendum have been very strongly pro-Brexit. For neithers, you see they're pro-Remain, but not dramatically so, and for others, the same. This is an interesting finding. So what we found is that those who say they have Remain or Leave identities, these identities are very or fairly strongly held, much more so than unionist and nationalist identities. So what we have seen over the last few years is a strengthening and hardening, if you like, of nationalist identities in particular. So last year, we found that 30% of nationalists say that they very strongly hold that identity. But that was a dramatic increase from the year before, it's around 22%. This contrasts very greatly. So if somebody says that they're a Remainer or a Leaver, they mean that they hold those identities very strongly, and that's an interesting factor. We don't know whether that will strengthen that Remain nationalist, that will strengthen nationalist parties because they can capitalise on the pro-Remain point as well. We don't know how that will be managed by unionist parties, whether they will try and just knuckle down into that pro-Leave sentiment. We don't know. A big question for everybody, I think, is what does pro-Remain look like now that we're outside of the EU and Northern Ireland is outside of the European Union. Interestingly, across different community backgrounds, we see that there's and this has been consistent over the past few years, a desire for Northern Ireland's relationship, or sorry, for the UK's relationship with the EU to be a close one. Very few people wanting it to be a distant one, even those from a sort of a pro-Leave background, and that's interesting. And then finally, the big question, does Brexit make United Ireland more likely? And overall, we found this is where things really kind of come to a head. And basically, we see that for nationalists, it makes them think United Ireland is more likely. And this result has been steadily growing over the past few years. Unionists think about it very differently. For them, there's been a slight increase in those who think it makes United Ireland more likely, but the majority unionist position is that it makes it doesn't really make much of a difference. And then the second part of that is, well, does Brexit make you more in favour of United Ireland? And again, unionists aren't saying it's made them more resistant to it. It just says it makes no difference to their views about Irish unity. Bear in mind that would include unionists who are Remainers as well. But for nationalists, the picture is very different. Brexit for them has made them more in favour of United Ireland and more expectant of it. And I think that's very notable, that for those who are nationalists or were nationalists to begin with, that basically Brexit has made them expect Irish unity, and the language used to talk about Irish unity is of something that is inevitable now. And this is complete transformation from the way it was even 5 years ago. They would talk about it and, you know, they would hope for it, but not necessarily expect it. And so we have a situation in Northern Ireland where there are persistent divisions, as there always have been, and in some ways those divisions are becoming more entrenched. Not just in terms of, not in terms of the sort of polarized sentiment, but essentially just different expectations about what the future looks like for unionism. And to pick up on Richard's really fascinating presentation, unionism, of course, is in a very unusual situation, wondering what the union itself will look like, and how that's handled even in the coming few months by unionist parties in Northern Ireland, I think will make a huge difference to the stability of Northern Ireland, and what might happen in the coming years. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks for that. Really appreciate that. I thought there was a non-sectarian party. Was it the Alliance in the?
Yeah, Alliance. Yes, Alliance is the non-aligned party.
Yeah.
The seat in the Minister for Justice, a seat in the coalition. They did very well in 2019. They really did extraordinarily well in various different elections. The Green Party did well as well. And if you look at the data for that, it looks as though that was very much a pro-Remain vote. They got supporters from who would otherwise have voted in the past for nationalist or for unionist parties. So they took vote across the community. We don't know whether that's pro-Remain. So what does that look like now that Northern Ireland's outside of the EU? That's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I suppose my only other comment there in terms of that data is, can you, what's the technical term, stratify that by age group? I mean, do you notice any particular divergences between the young and the old, for example?
Yes, you do. Yes, it gets a little bit difficult because you're dealing with smaller numbers then, but it's not necessarily so. Where you see the biggest difference is very much in terms of national identity. So British, we ask them sort of, do they feel more Irish than British or both? You know, this kind of thing. And what you do see is that younger people are more likely to say that they have Irish identity, and this has been growing over time. And much less likely to say they have a British identity.
Is that amongst the Protestant young as well?
You don't get many Protestants saying they have an Irish identity, but they might say it's a bit of Irish, you know, a bit of both.
Yeah.
That you do get that, yeah. But there's also been a growth in Northern Irish identity as well.
Yes, I was going to ask about that, because I once had it put to me by a colleague from Belfast, and nobody in Northern Ireland is Northern Irish, or either Irish or you're British. And I thought, well, that's interesting then.
Well, there's been some interesting studies on that recently, and there is a growing Northern Irish identity, but it means different things in different contexts. You'll be surprised to hear.
No, I'm utterly fascinated by that, but I suppose if I get the chance to talk to you again about that, I will. But thank you for that. Thank you. Now, well, I'll move on to our final speaker, last but not least, Mike Danson. Mike is an economist by background, amongst other things, as I've said. Yes, Emeritus Professor of Enterprise Policy at Heriot-Watt University and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. I'm also mindful, Mike, that you've had a prominent role in the Regional Studies Association in times past president, weren't you, at one point?
Yep.
Yeah, so, to remind listeners, of course, Mike has published widely on rural, regional and island communities, of course, with the island communities in Scotland, for example, microbreweries as well, minority languages and many other areas, with 18 books, 100 book chapters and over 500 papers of one form or another. On that note, Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Don't have much time, so I'll just hammer straight in.
No, carry on, Mike. Don't feel pressured that way. One of the joys of this format is that we're not religiously bound to stop at 10:30. If people wish to carry on a bit, they can. So don't worry too much there.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so the subheading now, what sort of Scotland do we want to be? That became the dominant point of discussion for many people in pubs at football matches and so on in the year and the run up to the Scottish independence referendum 2014. That's quite amazing. If you go to football pubs, things you don't talk about are respectively politics and politics. That second subheading, what kind of country are we seeking to build, was one of the tasks set for the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland, a randomly selected group of people who've been meeting over the last year. And that's interesting because those two really underpins a lot of the differences, I'm going to argue, between Scotland and the rest of the UK, or particularly England, of how politics and views and differences have been developing over the last few years. Okay, can I get rid of that up there? Probably not. Okay, what I'm going to do is just really report on lots of different opinion polls and figures and so on. None of it's primary research by me, apart from towards the end. The New States, amongst others, has this rolling programme of looking at what the opinion polls are saying at the moment. Almost all opinion polls in the last few months are forecasting the SNP are going to win something like 70 seats in the Scottish Parliament elections in May. We have an election system that's PR to an extent. It's meant to ensure that no party, and particularly a nationalist party, can ever win a majority. 70 out of 129 seats is a majority. Add in the Greens are very close to the SNP in terms of independence and Europeanness and such, then you can see there's an overwhelming support likely to come from parliamentarians come May for independence and rejoining the European Union. On the right of this screen, you can see, again, long-term polls from January 2016 to date. The last 20 opinion polls in Scotland say that a majority, after you take out don't knows, a majority be in favour of independence. So there's this clear and consistent majority developing for independence and for a strong nationalist government. Detail here isn't really important. On the left is an article I wrote after the 2014 independence referendum, and it tried to put into context what had been happening in Scotland, because people, academics, senior academics, particularly in England, were astonished at why there'd been such a big turnout and why it'd been very close to the independence vote winning. The arrow there points to the fact that 96% of people registered to vote and 86% actually voted. The reasons for such very high numbers, because they were records for the UK, the reasons for that was because many people who'd never voted before or had never registered before were encouraged to enrol. There were various stories from some of the very poorest areas in Scotland from people who'd not only never voted, but had never gone onto the register of actually processing to vote collectively behind pipers. These are places that had traditionally voted Labour or Communist, Independence Labour Party and so on, but had ceased to vote because they saw no point. So there'd been something changes there. After the Brexit referendum, again, I went down to London for meetings with very senior academics, and they were in shock. How on earth had this happened? How on earth had Britain, the UK, voted to leave? And I wrote another article in Regions, the magazine of Regional Studies Association, saying we'd gone through this journey in Scotland of saying what sort of country do we want to be. There have been discussions and debates and meetings for at least 18 months before the independence referendum. Every night of the year, apart from Christmas and Hogmanay, where hundreds, if not thousands of people turned up for meetings and physically turned up. The other side of that was academics and activists were going around chapping doors in the poorest areas, pardon me, were raising the debate, not the standing debate, but just a debate. In other words, people, for the first time, often had hope they could see a different future. When we look at Brexit, what I've picked out there is the two least pro-independence parts of Scotland, Scottish borders, Dumfries and Galloway, on the border with England, they both voted in favour of remaining in the European Union. A very poor working class part of Scotland, East Ayrshire, at the top of that table on the right, voted almost 59% to remain. Just across the border, similar areas were voting very differently. So in other words, it wasn't just a line across the United Kingdom here. There was something else happening. You have seen this before. This was the vote for remain in yellow or leave in blue. Every single constituency in Scotland voted to remain, every single one. And yet when we look at the economic implications of Brexit, according to the much respected Fraser-Andrews Institute at Strathclyde, they said that although there will be a negative impact on Scotland, other things being equal, that negative impact of Brexit would be less than in the rest of the UK. So the costs of leaving for Scotland, of voting to leave, other things being equal, would be less than they would elsewhere. And yet, Scotland went the other way and voted in favour strongly to remain. So again, something's happening. And that continued. When we get up to the European elections, sorry, it covers my own name, the European Parliament elections, the last ones, again, the SNP won every single constituency vote apart from the Northern Isles or in Shetland. And again, in PR, they got half of the seats. So again, Scotland was voting quite differently from the rest of the UK. The general election last December, doesn't time fly. Again, apart from the areas that tended to vote against independence most strongly, the northeast of Scotland, the borders, Dumfries and Galloway, again, the SNP was quite dominant. It increased its number of seats up to 48 out of 59. Again, size of constituency, geography and so on exaggerates, but you can see quite a different way of voting north and south of the border. And the red wall, much talked about, that fell in the north of England, there's one little constituency there in Edinburgh. It's the only Labour seat left in Scotland. So things are different, not only between Scotland and England and Wales on the one hand, but also between Scotland in 2019 and, for instance, in 1979, 1989, even 1999. Scotland has moved quite strongly to a different place in the world. Over the last year, obviously, COVID. There are lots of different statistics you could put up and so forth. The one that really highlights differences, I think, the most is deaths attributed to COVID. And Scottish Government went early on to say, if there's a hint that it's down to COVID, sadly, we ascribe that. So Scotland's ahead of the game in admitting the size of the problem that COVID was generating and also not trying to hide the statistics. And yet, look, this huge difference in the number of deaths attributed since the second wave really started to come in November. And it's been falling in Scotland, still increasing in England. And interest Scotland and Northern Ireland tracking each other quite strongly. Something quite different happening in England. What are the political ramifications? This is a set of polls in Scotland, just for Scottish voters, but though we see quite similar down in the rest of the UK. Who do you rate as a leader in addressing the COVID crisis? In Scotland, Boris Johnson comes out quite badly. For some reason, he's decided to visit us today. That's by the way. Nicola Sturgeon, overwhelmingly, during the COVID crisis, has got a massive positive satisfaction rating. Sorry. The Scottish Government, again, overwhelmingly positive rating from Scots of how they've handled the crisis. David Clegg, journalist, written a lot with Daily Record, in the Courier in Dundee and so on, by no means a nationalist. And he stressed very strongly that this appears to be about the leadership qualities of Nicola Sturgeon on one hand, Boris Johnson on the other, and that they are exaggerating and bringing forth other differences. Again, polls, what's driving Scotland towards independence? Here, Boris Johnson is seen as a very negative impact for those in favour of the Union. So people are far more likely to say they would vote for independence because of Boris Johnson. But again, here, European Union, very strong reason for voting for independence or moving towards voting for independence. People who just want to get it over with, the independence question, again, more likely to vote for independence. But the negative impact of the Westminster government and its difficulties in managing the crisis comes out also. Interesting towards the bottom, it's not about the economy, stupid. The majority of people think we'd maybe be no better off, if not worse off, under independence. Economy-wise, although turn it on its head, a majority think we'd be better or no worse off. So the economy doesn't appear to be that much of a difference in driving people, how they would vote. It's other things. In the run-up to the 2014 referendum, David Cameron, if we remember him, said, of course, Scotland could be independent, but we're better together. So in launching the Independence Convention, where I was a speaker in the relaunch of it, in the annual seminar between the Scottish Trade Union Congress and the Economics Committee of the Scottish Parliament, I gave the same sort of paper, the same presentation, which was questioning David Cameron, that we weren't better. In fact, we can find small countries in the north of Europe which are stronger without being part of the UK. They're more resilient, more robust, more competitive. They have less poverty, more gender equality, fairer, more prosperous. And there's lots and lots of rankings which show the Nordic countries, Ireland nowadays, the Netherlands, Belgium, pardon me, so forth, performing much better than the UK, and therefore within that than Scotland. Therefore, David Cameron's argument that we're better together was undermined by the analysis. And so we've got to a point where Scotland doesn't see itself as a UK, as staying in the UK, as that being something that is mutually beneficial and incontrovertible. And indeed, there's a consensus that Scotland would have a better, more sustainable, inclusive, resilient recovery and renewal if we were independent. And so the thought processes, the beliefs and so on have moved in Scotland. And all of these are much stronger influences amongst the young than the old. And over the COVID pandemic, women have become far more likely to be in favour of independence than beforehand, whereas the male vote, according to polls, is about the same as before. As well as hope comes confidence. This is an organisation of business people, business in Scotland, and they've been producing a lot of data, well-argued, robust statistics as evidence. And that again is suggesting that we should have the confidence, not just hope, of a better place. These are all impressionistic and perceptions of people, but it's moved Scotland forward. Last couple of slides. This is from Wall Street, 24/7 newspaper, magazine, and so on, produced from there. And it's basically saying in this quote that small countries can be happier and healthier and wiser and have less unemployment and less poverty and so on. And the way they've termed it is not all nations, not all. Strong belief in Scotland increasingly is, but we can be like those nations and we can come out of this often called failing state. The told propaganda might say we can move from poverty to prosperity. Point of these two bullet points isn't so much about whether that propaganda is true, but it's the sort of language that's used in discussing Scotland's future. Pardon me. It's about sharing. It's about quality and distribution of growth. It's about communities, social environment, sustainability. It's the sort of terms and terminology that we don't hear from the Westminster government, which is more macho and so forth. So this slide here, which I downloaded, captures what some of the differences are. And it really brings down of which union Scots and Scotland will want to be in, because it is being opposed one to the other. I've picked out in green there ones that would not be achieved under a federal system, because over the last couple of weeks we've heard from Gordon Brown and others that magically federalism, which gets rolled out whenever the vote for independence looks like it's becoming too positive, federalism said it'll deal with this. It would give Scotland more powers and so on. But if we're in federalism, what would stay at Westminster? Actually, some of the key issues picked out in green that mark out what would remain at Westminster. Trident nuclear weapons would still be on the doorstep of Glasgow. We wouldn't be able to be an inclusive society given the sort of rhetoric we're getting from the Conservatives in Scotland and from down south and so on. Final one, so Scotland's future, what would it be like? Could it be the continuing development of underdevelopment of the Scottish economy? We're seeing that food and drink, other aspects, the key aspects of the Scottish economy being undermined by the terms of Brexit. We're seeing further external ownership and control of the economy, which again contrasts with the Nordic countries and so forth. And yet we've got huge natural capital resources, between a quarter and a third of all renewable resources, potential in the whole of Europe. And we've got the highest number of papers and proportion of educated people in the world and so on. And again, what are the sort of terms being used by people about Scotland's future? These are quite different from the sort of terms we hear from the Westminster government. Finally, I think underpinning an awful lot of what was said by the previous speakers of those who voted leave, those who say making Britain great again, and so on. The programmes we've got, the stamps that are coming out, etc., are harking back. So Scotland is in a position where increasingly over the last few years it's been debating, discussing, thinking about its own future. What sort of future do we want? Just pick it up. Given we've got a Welshman and others in the audience, think of the songs that are sung, the anthems at the start of rugby union matches, internationals. Is it Jerusalem, ancient towns looking back, or the sentiments and flair of Scotland? That those days of empire, and Scotland's benefits from that, and have been part of the United Kingdom, are in the past for many. We've moved on. We're a European, inclusive, etc. country. Is the perception, is the sentiment being expressed by more and more people? Sorry if I've gone on too long there. Thank you.
Not at all, Mike. Thank you for that. I mean, as I said, I mean, we officially have quite a few minutes for questions, and if you're all amenable, we can carry on a bit further. I mean, given that, not going anywhere, so to speak, and the joy with this, of course, is people can do other things in the background. I'm going to pick up on the fishing issue, because I saw in your slide there 70% of the catch. I think it was Murray in the far north where the Leave vote came close to being majority. I think it was about 50.3% Remain. Is the current fracas around fishing and the huge disruption to the export markets having any visible impact on those northeast communities in terms of their sentiment?
It's interesting because Yeah, what's interesting about fishing is the way it's presented within Scotland, never mind across the UK. A lot of people in the fishing sector in Scotland are actually voted to remain. They're in favour of independence and so on. They're inshore fishermen. They're more on the west coast, the islands and so forth. They're being very badly damaged by Brexit in that they can't get the fish to their markets, which are in France and Spain, Portugal and so on. And they're sent live, but it's a long journey by road. Murray in the northeast, yes, voted. Interestingly, originally it was quite strong SNP voting, and then it started voting Conservative, and it's because they were going to benefit. Without going into great detail, that northeast fishing industry is dependent on 5 very rich families. Conservative got a lot of time on the media saying how beneficial it would be if we had a Conservative government, if we were out of the European Union. They have not been helped at all by the terms of the Brexit deal, particularly with regard to the common fisheries policy, which has left them with a lower catch than before, and so forth. And therefore, we're beginning to see that, yes, there haven't been any polls as such, but the sentiments definitely suggest there will be a move away from that Conservative vote.
That'll be very interesting to see come May with the Holyrood elections, of course. No, well, again, thank you for that. I'm going to move to the questions now. I did see one there that made a point about, I think it may have been English regionalism, and your comment, small is beautiful, leaves us here in the West Midlands thinking that, wouldn't it be great to have a similar devolved power in the form of an assembly and so on. I mean, certainly our own research has picked up on this, that voters see the difference in terms of being disempowered. It may well be a question I would ask to all panelists. I mean, Mike, your point there about federalism notwithstanding, is there any mileage in that model? If anyone else wishes to comment in that regard. Yeah, Richard.
So I've spent about 10 years looking for support in England for regionalism, and you can find it very easily. Centre-left politicians love it in particular. Your occasional Tory, George Osborne, has a flutter with it. But what you can't find is strong public support for it. And we've tried looking for, at the official regions, and nothing doing there. So people then tell us, well, actually, people don't identify with the East Midlands or whatever. So try something else. So we've tried things like the North and other kind of broad categories. And you struggle to find public support there. People say, well, it's city regions is where it's at. And then you go, well, people in Bury are not particularly keen on being bunched in with Manchester, but okay, we'll try that. And you can't find strong support for city regions either. And every time you ask, would you prefer an all-England solution to a regional solution within England? Every time you get an overwhelming majority saying that they want an all-England solution, even though that is very, very vague and incoherent. So there may well be good arguments for, I get all the arguments that England is very centralised and it would be a good, sensible idea functionally to do regional devolution within England, although, question mark, does England really want, well, even if you did that, would you want legislative devolution within England on the same level as the devolved territories? Question mark. But while there are good functional arguments for devolving England, the kind of the weakest arguments are this is because what the public in England wants. There's no evidence for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd point of clarification about our own work is sort of based on interviews and focus groups. I'm not trying to make a wider point here about representativeness necessarily, but correct me if I'm wrong, but the Northeast referendum that took place in 2004 with one Dominic Cummings leading the so-called Nesno campaign, there was a portent for the future. Did that not start out with a majority according to polls, which I appreciate the limitations of those thereof, with a majority in favour of a devolved creation prior to that Nesno campaign.
Well, so I've never seen any persuasive data that suggests that there is majority support. And obviously they went for the Northeast because they thought that that's where they had the best chance of winning. And they lost 4-1. So, you know, one of the problems that supporters of regional devolution in England have, and I've got every sympathy personally, even though it's, it's not, it's up to the people of England to decide how they get governed at the end of the day. But one of the problems that English regionalists have is that they always posit English regionalism against England as a unit, because England as a unit is somehow unacceptable, and they're always going to lose that argument. So if people are serious about English regionalism, my advice to them would be, don't argue for it against treating England as a unit, or you will lose.
Yeah, it's still interesting though that again, the town hall meetings and the like, you do get amongst the Leave voters that we encountered, you do get this very strong sense of London gets everything.
Yeah.
So that there is something there, even if it's not expressed as support for a regional tier of government for whatever reason.
There is. I don't know of a country where there isn't a sense that the capital city gets too much.
No, but
in Wales and indeed in England, you find it in Cardiff and in London. So people in Cardiff and in London will say that Cardiff gets too much or London gets too much. This is like, to read from that to support for regionalism is a big.
Big jump. Oh, look, I could tease you further on that one, but I'm also mindful that we have some other questions. I invite you all to sort of peruse through the listener questions and see if there's anything there you particularly feel you want to answer. Let's see here. Q&A.
Alex on Northern Ireland, I can answer those.
Yeah, please, Katie. Yes.
Just to pull them. So, from John's question about Scottish independence. Yeah, so we haven't those results I presented were the latest ones that we have from late 2019, early 2020. So we haven't seen that, but I would suspect it doesn't really make much difference. And funnily enough, if you look at the Sunday Times article and the Lucid Talk polls on that, which were basically saying, how would you feel if Scotland becomes independent? About 43% of respondents in Northern Ireland said they would be upset by it, and I would presume those would be unionists. But I certainly wouldn't anticipate that translating into support for Irish unification. And then Richard's question about the Northern Ireland Assembly remaining in place. Yeah, so again, we did ask that question in that particular survey in 2019. And notably, this was something that seemed to encourage Catholics to be more supportive of a United Ireland, which is strange. Now, interestingly, that question is we tend to assume that a Northern Ireland Assembly continuing would reassure unionists, because in effect it would make Northern Ireland continue in some form as some kind of unit in a United Ireland. However, there is some need for caution there, because if we have a situation in which you have a majority of people in Northern Ireland voting for Irish unification, what that would mean, would mean a nationalist majority, which would be reflected therefore in the Northern Ireland Assembly. So we may well have continued power sharing, whatever that would look like in United Ireland. But nonetheless, we would be confident then that Sinn Féin would be dominant in that executive, and that the nationalist parties would dominate in the Assembly. So although you'd have some continued mechanisms for cross-community consent and all of that kind of thing, it wouldn't necessarily be the assurance to unionist identity that we might otherwise presume.
Okay. Mike, I see a question here from John Struthers for you. Mike, it should be noted that voting SNP in Scottish and Westminster elections is not synonymous with voting for independence. Do you have a riposte to that?
Yeah. for some, but not almost equally, other parties in Labour, the Greens and so on, are also in favour of independence, but may not shop as such if we just go on numbers. What's the point of the question? I think it's what it's pointing out is that people who vote SNP appreciate what they're doing more generally in terms of education and health and run the economy within the powers they have. If you look at that, the very pro Nicola Sturgeon Scottish Government handling of the COVID pandemic, this is way over 70–80%. That really suggests they're seen as a competent government. And one thing that has been apparent over the period of the pandemic is this move to support independence amongst women, for instance, in particular, because they perceive a First Minister who's caring, sharing, has certain qualities that we don't get from many of the opposition politicians. So what does that suggest? The potential is maybe to increase the vote for independence. And we've now got a floor that is well above 50%.
Yeah, I mean, it's another angle there is it's sort of like normalising, is it? When you have an SNP administration in government doing the business of government, it somehow starts to feel more natural maybe to some people who are sort of wavering or indifferent or unsure on the question that maybe pushes them in that direction. Is there an element of that, do you think?
Yes. There's certain demographics. One is that young people are overwhelmingly in favour of independence. It declines with age. Whether that's a cohort effect or you change your views as you get older isn't yet clear. Colleagues on here who are sophologists, political scientists, have a better insight on that. I used to work for Strathclyde Regional Council in the 1980s. That came in just with a Labour majority in the early 70s, or mid-70s. By the time it was abolished, it was a very, very strong Labour authority, the biggest authority in Europe, in fact. And it was seen as a technocratic, competently run local authority. People voted it because they were running it well. I think the SNP has become like that. It's the natural party of government in Scotland, in a way that was never envisaged even 15, 20 years ago.
No, and I suppose, without wanting to sort of go too far into the point, where it leaves Labour in Scotland is really, what can you say? Richard, I think this comment may come back to you a bit here from Leslie Budd. Oh, hello, Les. But in the large metro regions, there may be these kind of implications post-COVID, e.g. Andy Burnham's dust up with Westminster government. Any observations there?
Yeah, maybe. I think that's, I'm having been active in this area for a decade or so. I'm, looking for evidence of an uptick in support for regionalism. And I think this, the most optimistic kind of news I've seen for proponents of regionalism is that COVID may have helped kind of raise the profile of people like Andy Burnham and potentially increase support for more devolved powers. So yeah, maybe it's early days. They're starting from a very low base, mind, and I would be very, very surprised given the preponderance of views in favour of treating England as a unit if you have to choose.
Yeah.
I'd be very surprised if it would challenge that. And I mean, the other thing that is kind of germane here is that, we're talking about Brexit. The precursor for Brexit was the 2015 general election, where David Cameron won that unexpected to David Cameron, I think, general election victory. And because they had the pledge to hold a referendum, which they never expected to have to implement. How did the Conservatives win that referendum? Well, I've got a book coming out on this very shortly, but that will remind people that the 2015 general election was run in the marginal seats in England on the basis of ensuring that Labour wasn't propped up by the SNP, that you didn't have, you'll remember that post that started off with Alex Salmond with
Ed Miliband, yeah.
Miliband in his pocket, and then it shifted to Nicola Sturgeon during the campaign. And the people who ran that campaign for the Conservatives explicitly say that they were playing on English anti-Scottish sentiment. It wasn't simply an anti-SNP thing. They were mobilising nationality politics in that referendum. So, you know, it's not just Brexit is exposing and deepening things which were there already. And, you know, if we are in a position where Labour looks as if it might come back to power in some kind of arrangement with the SNP, do you think for a moment that the Conservatives wouldn't rerun that campaign? I mean,
no, I fully expect that to occur in 2024, if not before then. Mike, I'll throw this one back at you. I think I can guess the answer here. But what about the Catholic-Protestant split in Scotland, which has a similar split to Northern Ireland?
Again, I've not seen an analysis, but anecdotally, and some of what I've read was, traditionally Catholics would be very ambivalent, if not antagonistic, towards independence for Scotland, because they saw it as being run by the Church of Scotland, Protestant, Presbyterian, so on. It was interesting. I'm a Celtic supporter, just watching over the 12, 18 months before the independence referendum, how Celtic supporters and representative Catholics moved towards being pro-independence. There are many Rangers supporters who are pro-independence as well. So like many of these things, it's not black and white or whatever. What is clear, and I noted especially that on the day after the referendum, I was to do a live broadcast on Russian television in George Square at about 7:30. But as I got closer to George Square in the centre of Glasgow, the sky was lit up with blue, and that was the riot police, because there was a start of a riot kicking off. And these were people wearing Union Jacks, dressed in orange, and so on. And that's become very apparent. It wasn't really during the referendum, but since then, there is a real alignment between follows a certain club, orangism, and so on, which has always been there in Scotland.
Yeah, I remember marches going up the road when I lived in Glasgow, and you'd hear the penny whistles, so I'm quite aware of it.
Yeah, so that's really come to the fore, and as a strong divide between one set who are very Scottish and British, or particularly British on the one hand, and in many ways the rest of the population, including the majority of Protestants and so forth.
Okay. Mike Grace says here, interesting point about why regional, inverted commas, isn't very popular. Is this as much about the credibility of local politicians and current political structures, regional, local and parish? Would increasing their quality credibility alongside more powers be part of the solution? Certainly the SNP sends its best and brightest to Holyrood. I mean, that's quite noticeable, whereas, you know, historically with the other parties, you wouldn't say that, you know. Panelists, any particular thoughts, responses there? No one? Richard?
It's a tough one. I think the instincts, you're playing. You've got I keep mentioning a book that I've got coming out in a few weeks. Obviously,
no worries.
This is the I'm doing the hard sell here, but we know that there are particular attitudes associated with different national narratives, and in England we know that there are definitely strong regional identities. They don't appear to map on to kind of political constitutional, they don't appear to have political constitutional implications.
No, and you're right with the NUTS1 regions. I mean, to me, they're just statistical artifices. So yeah, I could certainly see why nobody will identify themselves as a Northwesterner.
And then somebody's got somebody's put a question there about Yorkshire. There's clearly a strong Yorkshire identity. It doesn't appear to translate into any, people would like to see strong local governments, but kind of regional government, that we don't find the support for that. And you might say, well, it's about the caliber of the politicians, but I think that these things are much more historically rooted than that. I think there is a kind of theory of what appropriate government looks like, to which we talk about in this book, and that is, Westminster is our parliament. It should make the big decisions. We want local government, but basically we don't want much regional variation in terms of policy. And I think that is a very, very strong sentiment. So you want local government, you want your, the London kind of mayor. The idea that London should be governed as a unit is a strong idea, but it's local governments, not a version of the Welsh Parliament or the Scottish Parliament. I'm staying away from Northern Ireland, Katy, because you're here.
No, and on that note, Katy, how likely is it that the DUP, this is from Lydia Golden, how likely is it that the DUP will engage in conversations and debates around unification? Will a tactic of the DUP to be intentionally not to engage?
I think it's very unlikely. So any even moderate unionists are wary about engaging in conversations about Irish unification, and there's that's a perfectly rational response, you could say, because obviously the logic of unionism is opposed to that of Irish unity. So this is where you have these interesting challenges arising, because, for example, the Department of the Taoiseach in the South has established this shared island unit, possibly in response to the success of Sinn Féin in the last elections there.
Oh, yeah.
But also recognising, as I mentioned, that expectation of Irish unity in the North, and the huge challenges that any referendum, let alone process of unification, would entail. So it's setting up a series of dialogues on the future of the island, not, being very careful not to talk about it in any more political terms.
Yeah.
Struggling, of course, to engage with unionism. And because, not least, anybody who does any, unionist figure who does engage with it immediately comes under pressure for doing so. And so even though, nationalists would say, well, you need to engage in this because if we do have a referendum and then we have this process of Irish unification, it's much better that you're around the table, and that you can therefore shape the representation such as it would be for Unionists or British in a future United Ireland. But I think possibly if it looks as, if the Secretary of State does decide to call a referendum there, and it looks sort of inevitably going in that direction, then maybe, some of the focus groups you've had would suggest that some unionists would be willing to engage, but fundamentally, the unionist response is to say, we won't play any part in such conversations. A, we don't think United Ireland is inevitable. We don't think it's likely. And B, as unionists, we don't feel comfortable at all in engaging in these sort of speculative conversations. So the answer is no, I don't see the DUP engaging in any such conversations. The flip side of that, of course, is that we don't see nationalists at the moment being willing to engage at all in commemorations of the centenary of Northern Ireland. So it works both ways.
Yeah. No, thanks there. Jay, a question for you here from Leslie Budd. Much has been made of narcissism of political leaders in recent years. Is English collective narcissism, as you define it, rooted in these political developments, or will it fade?
No, it doesn't seem like it's going to fade. I think it's more about how you were raised and how you defined what it meant to be English from a childhood into adulthood. It didn't seem to be very tied to maybe local recent politics or anything like that.
Okay. Observation here from Mary Dejewski. Oh, hello. A reason why people don't want English devolution along regional lines is because they see it as being fobbed off with something that isn't being recognised as nationhood within English Parliament, etc. If the UK were to split up and England become a nation state, regionalism might be popular in that framework, but recognition of England has to come first. I might ask all the panelists for their thoughts on that. Mike.
I used to be editor of Regions, that magazine I referred to. I remember writing at one point, if Scotland's not a nation, what is England? And then if Scotland became independent, would England become a nation? And thirdly, why do you let somebody else define you? I think for a long time, England just hasn't recognised itself. That conversation we had around independence, which then informed the Brexit vote, of what nation do we want to be, what future do we want, and so on, was very important. Everybody in the country was involved in that national conversation. From the outside, I don't think England's had that conversation. It might have voted differently over Brexit in the last general election and so forth, if it actually determined, talked to itself about what it is and where it wants to go and what sort of future does it want. I think until it has that honest conversation within and across the country, then it will continue to make, I would argue, bad choices.
Okay, Katy?
This is the question about English nationhood.
Yeah, the comment here from Mary Dievsky, if you see it there, just in case you want to check it again.
Yeah, well, I guess my only comment would be, of course, Northern Ireland was created. Although people talk about the four nations, obviously Northern Ireland isn't a nation. England is much more of a nation, if you like, than Northern Ireland ever was or ever could be. So, you know, I wouldn't see, I wouldn't necessarily see that as being a problem for England if we move towards English Parliament per se.
Mm-hmm. Richard?
Yeah, I think that Mary has a good point, and I think there's a lot in that. And certainly, as I've already intimated, if regionalism is being argued for against England, then regionalism loses. But I would kind of, I guess, as a final point, really, I would say that I think there's a danger that we spend time here talking about the kinds of futures that we might like, and I certainly don't blame Michael in particular for doing that. But I kind of finished my talk by saying that I think there's a danger that we end up with a kind of stasis here.
Yeah.
The government undermines devolution, which is already doing, that it denies a democratic route to independence for Scotland, and that what we end up with is a kind of a very, very unpleasant long-term future where there's a crisis of state legitimacy that's very closely tied to senses of national identity, which makes it incredibly powerful, very difficult to move away from. And so that we end up with this kind of, so, I mean, Katy was painting a picture of a Northern Ireland that potentially might not change that much. Be in this position for the long term. Wales is probably getting more divided. You're seeing the growth in support for independence, but also abolish being pushed as well. And so that kind of polarization. And so I think there's rather than planning for a federal future or whatever, I think there's a real danger that we end up with a very toxic stasis, which I think is, that might be the long-term outcome of Brexit.
Yes. And finally, Jay, any observations there?
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I think in terms of England questioning its own identity, I didn't, from the respondents I talked to in the focus groups, there didn't seem to be very much appetite for really investigating what it means to be English or what the future of England is. It was very much focused on debates about Brexit and the merits of it, rather than being really reflective, I think.
Okay, and I'll leave you all before we do our goodbyes with the observation that there are people in Sutton Coldfield, which is a wealthy north suburb of Birmingham, who still insist that they are part of the Metropolitan Borough of Sutton Coldfield, which of course was abolished in the 1974 reorganisation of local government boundaries. That also led to the creation of Strathclyde, as it was, Mike, didn't it? I think. But anyway, it's a funny thing, identity. You know, we have the Black Country here, which of course is a very strong sense of identity. But look, I want to thank all our panelists again for, you know, what I think has been a really fascinating, stimulating, and clearly by the comments in the audience that we've had, conversation, and I can only, you know, reiterate my gratitude to you all for taking part. We do these on a monthly basis. That the next topic that we're looking to put in place, Beth can correct me if I get my dates mixed up, will be a webinar on the Northern Ireland Protocol of the Withdrawal Agreement. Now, the economic implications of what we're interested in here. So thank you, Leslie Budd, for suggesting that one. I would appreciate you being a speaker in that event. You know, watch our website, you know, look at us on Twitter and what's the other one, LinkedIn, etc., and other social media platforms where you can, and our website, of course, where you can keep abreast of these future events. So signing off now, the Zoom will automatically end at 11 anyway, so we have to get off. Thank you all again. I don't mind it ran over time. Like I said, it was a real stimulating debate, and hope to see you next time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.